Hello everyone, I am very glad that you're joining this story. Subscribe, like and comment. Enjoy the story, smile more often.
If someone had told me 10 years ago that I'd spend nearly a decade quietly paying my parents' rent without so much as a thank you in return, I probably would have laughed and asked if they'd mistaken me for some kind of saint. But life has a twisted sense of humor, and the joke was on me. See, there's a kind of loyalty that's bred in the bones, not born from love, but forged from guilt and habit. That's the kind of loyalty I carried. The kind that whispers you owe them, even when every piece of logic screams otherwise. The kind that keeps you tethered to people who wouldn't flinch if you drowned, as long as they stayed dry. I grew up in a house that was colder than the Midwest winters outside our drafty walls. We weren't poor, not exactly, but we weren't rich in anything that really mattered either. Affection? Non-existent. Praise? Rare as a solar eclipse. My parents believed in rules, in silence, in doing what was expected without asking why. I remember once getting straight A's on a report card and bringing it home, practically vibrating with pride. My mother glanced at it for all of 3 seconds before saying, "That's what you're supposed to do." That was it. No smile, no hug, just a nod and a return to the evening news. So I learned early that love wasn't something freely given in our house. It was a transaction, and I was always overdrawn. Still, somewhere deep inside, I kept hoping that maybe if I was good enough, dependable enough, useful enough, they'd notice. Maybe they'd finally see me, not just as the daughter who took up space at the dinner table, but as someone worth caring about. I clung to that hope for far too long. By the time I turned 25, I'd moved out and gotten a modest job in marketing. Nothing flashy, nothing groundbreaking, but it paid the bills and gave me a little sliver of independence. That freedom tasted like oxygen after years of suffocating under their roof. I started building a life of my own, a small apartment, a cheap car, and a collection of houseplants I tried and mostly failed to keep alive. But just as I was beginning to breathe, the call came. My parents were struggling. My dad had taken early retirement after some kind of fallout at work he refused to talk about. My mother's health was starting to falter, though she'd never admit it aloud. They were behind on rent, the car was falling apart, and the fridge was often more empty than full. And so, with that same bone-deep loyalty gnawing at me, I started sending money. Just a little at first, help with the utility bill, a grocery delivery here and there. But little became regular, and regular became expected. Before I knew it, I was covering their entire rent each month. Then it was repairs, then medical bills, then car insurance. It snowballed faster than I could blink, and yet I never complained. Not once. I told myself it was what a good daughter does. I told myself they needed me. I told myself they'd do the same for me if the roles were reversed. God, what a lie that turned out to be. I gave up vacations. I turned down a job promotion that would have moved me to another city, too far to be of use to them. I dated men who questioned my finances, who couldn't understand why I was always strapped for cash. I'd shrug and say I was bad with money, too ashamed to admit the truth that my parents' needs came first and my life came dead last. I told myself it was noble. I told myself it meant something. But nobility doesn't pay your therapy bills, and sacrifice doesn't warm your bed when the nights get long and cold. Still, I pushed through. Year after year, month after month, I sent that money without hesitation. I became their invisible safety net, their unofficial insurance policy, the daughter who never said no. And then, the floor dropped out. It was a Tuesday afternoon when I got called into my boss's office. The company was downsizing. My department was being cut. I walked out with a cardboard box and a severance check that barely covered a month of my rent. For the first time in years, I needed help. I needed someone to say, "Don't worry, we've got you." Just once, I wanted to be the one leaning on someone else. So I went home, to the place I'd been helping keep afloat all these years, and I told them what happened. I told them I lost my job. I told them I might need to stay with them for a little while until I got back on my feet. And do you know what my father said? "We're not running a damn charity here." My mother just sat there, eyes blank, mouth tight. That was the moment everything changed. That was the moment I realized I'd never really been family. I'd just been useful. And now I wasn't even that. I walked into their living room that evening with my shoulders stiff and my throat dry, the weight of that severance letter still burning in my purse like a curse I hadn't earned. My palms were clammy and my heart was beating just a little too fast, not from shame or defeat, but from this thin flicker of hope I couldn't quite smother. Maybe, just maybe, this would be the moment where everything would shift, not in my career, not in my finances, but in something deeper. Maybe I'd finally see a sliver of warmth from the people I had spent years holding up like scaffolding around a house that never had enough foundation to stand on its own. Maybe they'd say something kind. Maybe they'd see me for once, not as a provider, not as a paycheck, but as their daughter. I sat on that same couch I'd helped them replace 2 years earlier when the springs broke and Mom complained her back ached every morning. I sat there with my knees tight together and my voice just above a whisper, and I told them the truth. That I'd been let go. That the company was restructuring. That I didn't have another job lined up yet, but I was already applying and something would come soon. That I just need a little help getting through the next few weeks. That maybe I could stay here a while, just until I found something stable again. I wasn't expecting balloons or cake or even a pat on the back. But I wasn't expecting what came next either. My father didn't even look up from the sports recap on the television. He just muttered it. One short sentence, flat and cold, like he was commenting on the weather. We're not running a damn charity. It took me a second to process it. I thought maybe he didn't understand. Maybe he misheard. But then I turned to my mother, and I swear to God, the woman couldn't even meet my eyes. She crossed her arms, looked at the floor, and said in that tight-lipped tone she always used when she wanted to seem rational instead of cruel, "You'll have to move out by the end of the week." No warmth. No hesitation. Just those words, clipped and final, like a judge handing down a sentence. I stared at them, and it was like someone had pulled the air straight out of the room. These were the people I'd kept afloat for nearly a decade. I'd skipped dinners out, walked to work in the snow when my own car died, and borrowed clothes from thrift stores so they could keep their heat on. I'd sat in emergency rooms beside them, paid for their prescriptions, and lied to my friends about why I couldn't go out on weekends. And now, the first time I needed them, not forever, not even for long, they couldn't spare a goddamn ounce of grace. I didn't say a word. I didn't shout. I didn't cry in front of them. I stood up slowly, the room spinning slightly, and walked to the hallway where my old bedroom still smelled faintly of lemon cleaner and dust. I started packing that night, not because I had a place to go, but because I couldn't bear to stay one more moment in that house. It wasn't a home. It never had been. It was just a place I'd poured my soul into, hoping to grow something soft from soil that had always been cold and bitter. I folded my clothes with shaking hands, wrapped my old books in newspaper, and boxed up the few childhood relics I'd kept: a faded photo from second grade, a tarnished medal from a spelling bee they never attended, a dried rose from a high school dance I'd gone to alone. I didn't cry for the lost security or the sudden uncertainty. I cried, quietly and briefly, for the little girl I used to be, the one who used to wait for approval that never came, who thought if she just worked hard enough, maybe love would arrive in return. By the time Friday rolled around, my things were in the trunk of my car, and the guest room where I'd slept those first few nights was empty again, ready for whoever might need it next: a distant cousin, a tenant, maybe just the silence. My mother stood by the kitchen sink when I walked out the door for the last time, her arms folded again like they were made of stone. My father didn't even come out of the den. I didn't say goodbye. I didn't leave a note. I didn't ask why. Because deep down, I already knew. I had just been a utility to them, a monthly deposit wrapped in skin, a transaction they'd grown used to cashing. And now, without income, I wasn't worth the space I occupied. But I made myself a promise that day, not a loud one, not one spoken aloud or scribbled in a journal, but a quiet, burning vow buried beneath my ribs. That one day, they would remember the silence. One day, they'd feel it echo through every corner of that house they thought I'd always be around to hold up. And they did, just not the way they expected. The day I pulled into the gravel lot of the rundown motel on the edge of town, it felt like every bone in my body had finally exhaled. The neon sign out front buzzed with a tired hum, the paint peeling off the letters like even the building was trying to disappear. It wasn't glamorous, it wasn't comfortable, and it damn sure wasn't home, but it was mine, if only for a while, and for the first time in years, I wasn't paying someone else's bills just to be tolerated in a house I helped hold together. The room was small, barely big enough for the sagging bed, a rusted mini fridge, and a battered nightstand that wobbled if you touched it wrong, but it was quiet and clean enough, and for now, that was all I needed. There was no kitchen, no space to stretch out, and no real insulation, which meant I could hear every cough, sigh, and argument from the room next door. But somehow, the noise didn't bother me. I'd lived in a house full of silence that screamed louder than any slammed door, so this chaos, this muffled life through thin motel walls, almost felt comforting in its honesty. No one here pretended. Everyone was just trying to make it through the damn day. I set my boxes on the floor, unpacked only what I absolutely needed, and stared at the cracked mirror above the dresser for what felt like hours. It had a jagged line running down the right side, splitting my reflection in two. Half of me looked tired, hollow-eyed, worn down by years of pretending to be unbreakable. The other half looked strangely calm, like something inside had finally snapped free from a chain I hadn't even realized was still wrapped around my neck. I leaned closer to that fractured glass, met my own gaze, and whispered, "I'm done begging for love." And I meant it. That first week was brutal. I applied to everything I could find: online gigs, remote temp jobs, editing work, writing work. Hell, I even filled out an application to transcribe courtroom audio at 2 in the morning while eating instant noodles with a plastic fork. I didn't have the luxury of being picky anymore, but I also refused to fall apart. Every rejection email was another punch to the ribs, but I kept going. I made a spreadsheet, color-coded it, updated it every night like my life depended on it, because it did. The second week, I landed a small freelance job writing product descriptions for a company that sold ergonomic office chairs. It wasn't glamorous, it wasn't steady, but it was money. A few days later, I picked up another client, editing social media captions for a yoga studio in Oregon. Then a third gig, then a fourth. Nothing was permanent, nothing was guaranteed, but the money started trickling in, and with every invoice paid, I felt a little less like a failure and a little more like a woman rebuilding herself from the dirt up. I started saving, even if it was just a few bucks at a time. I started tracking every dollar, learning to stretch meals across days, brewing my own awful coffee in a dented percolator I found at a thrift store. I didn't miss the noise of my old life. I didn't miss the forced dinners, the polite nods, the cold glances across the kitchen table. I learned to enjoy the quiet hum of solitude, the freedom to cry without hiding, the joy of waking up and knowing no one was watching me with disappointment in their eyes. Somewhere in the third week, I met Linda. She lived 2 doors down, a wiry older woman with cropped silver hair and a smoker's voice that carried across the parking lot even when she whispered. She'd lived in the motel off and on for years. Life had knocked her down more times than she could count, but she wore it like armor instead of shame. We started talking over laundry machines and late-night cigarette breaks, and before long, she became something I hadn't expected, a quiet mentor. A tough-as-nails kind of friend who never pitied me but somehow understood every crack in my voice before I even opened my mouth. She told me stories about starting over at 60, about losing everything and still managing to find something worth getting up for in the morning. She never gave me speeches or false hope. She just listened, nodded, and occasionally offered a piece of advice so sharp it cut through all the noise in my head. She told me once, sometimes surviving is louder than screaming. I wrote that down on a sticky note and taped it to the cracked mirror. By the end of the 4th week, I'd stopped flinching every time my phone buzzed. I had money in a savings account for the first time in years, not much, but enough to make me breathe easier. My work was still scattered, my future still uncertain, but for the first time in a long while, I felt like I was standing on my own 2 feet, not out of obligation, not out of guilt, but because I chose to. Then, exactly 1 month after I walked out of that house, my phone rang. It was my mother. And she was crying. The first thing I noticed was how her voice cracked under the weight of her own pride, like she'd never imagined a world where she'd have to call me again. Not like this. Not crying into the phone like a woman drowning in a flood she helped unleash. I didn't say much at first, just let her speak. Just let the silence settle between every sniffle and every half-swallowed sob, because I wanted to hear it, all of it. I wanted to know exactly how far the mighty had fallen now that their good little daughter wasn't there to keep the scaffolding from crumbling. She said the rent was overdue, that they'd been scraping by since I left, that things were starting to pile up in ways they couldn't manage anymore. The water heater burst last week, and the basement flooded halfway to the stairs. The car wouldn't start, something about a blown gasket or a leaking hose. She didn't know the details, just that it wouldn't move and they couldn't afford to fix it. The refrigerator was making a high-pitched hum like it was ready to die any second, and the landlord was threatening eviction if the rent didn't show up by Friday. I didn't respond right away, didn't let a single emotion show in my voice. I held the phone steady, leaned back against the wall of my motel room, and let the calm wash over me like armor. I had spent years drowning in their chaos, years patching holes in their sinking ship while they never once asked if I knew how to swim. But now the roles were reversed, and I wasn't about to throw them a lifeline without watching them flail just a little longer. I asked, gently, "Why don't you ask your other family for help?" I let the question hang there like a blade, sharp and deliberate. There was a pause on the other end, not the pause of someone thinking, but the pause of someone choking on their own discomfort. My mother stammered something about not wanting to bother her sister, said my cousins had their own lives, their own bills, their own problems. It was almost funny, really, how quickly she dismissed everyone else when it came time to actually need something. It had always been me, hadn't it? Always the fallback plan, the safety net, the one who never said no. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't gloat. I just kept it cool, steady, controlled, the same way they'd spoken to me the day they threw me out like yesterday's garbage. I said, "Funny how quickly things fall apart without the person you kicked out." She didn't argue. She didn't deny it. And that silence told me everything I needed to know. Then my father got on the phone, and I could hear the frustration boiling behind his words. He didn't beg, not yet, but he wasn't far from it. He said he didn't know how things had gotten this bad so fast, how everything seemed to break at once, how nothing was working and they didn't know who else to turn to. It took every ounce of restraint in me not to laugh. Because for years, I had been the glue holding their crumbling world together, and they never once saw it. But now, here they were, standing in the wreckage and finally realizing the cost of biting the hand that fed them. Still, I didn't hang up. I didn't say no. I didn't say yes either. I just listened. I let them keep talking, keep explaining, keep unraveling their own mess like they were trying to build a bridge back to me out of nothing but apologies and desperation. But I wasn't the same woman they'd thrown out a month ago. I'd changed, not just my address, not just my finances, but my spine. I wasn't going to be their savior again without a damn good reason. I told them I'd think about it, that I needed time. And then I hung up, calmly, without promising a damn thing. I walked over to the mirror, the same cracked one that had reflected every broken piece of me not that long ago, and I smiled. Not because they were suffering, not because I wanted revenge, but because for the first time, they had to see what life looked like without me cleaning up behind them. They called again the next day. And the day after that. My mother left voicemails, one after another, her voice growing more desperate with each message. My father even stopped pretending to be angry. He asked, plainly, if there was anything I could do. Anything at all. That's when I knew they were truly scared. That's when I knew they'd finally realized just how deep they'd buried their lifeline and just how far out of reach I'd drifted. So, I made them an offer, one I knew they'd never accept. When I finally called them back, I did it with a stillness in my voice so foreign to them, it almost sounded like someone else speaking through me. I didn't rush into pleasantries or ask how they'd been or pretend to care about the weather or the state of their leaky pipes. I spoke with the weight of every year I'd carried their burdens, Every holiday I'd spent alone because they couldn't be bothered to make space at the table for the daughter they only remembered when bills came due. I waited until they stopped tripping over their own words, until the awkward silences turned thick enough to cut, and then I gave them what they came crawling for, an offer. "You can move in with me," I said calmly, like I was offering them a ride to the store, like it was no more significant than handing someone a cup of coffee. But I let that sentence hang there, let them absorb it fully before I added the next part, the part that cracked their composure right down the middle. In the motel, I could hear my mother inhale sharply through the phone, the kind of sound someone makes when they're too proud to gasp but too stunned to stay quiet. My father didn't say a word at first, just this low grunt that I could tell was caught somewhere between offense and disbelief. They hadn't expected me to say yes to helping them, not on my terms anyway. They thought maybe I'd offer money again, or maybe offer to speak to the landlord, or find some other way to fix their problems from a distance without forcing them to actually face the truth about who I'd become without their chains around my neck. But I wasn't interested in rescue missions anymore. I was interested in balance. So I laid it out for them, slowly and deliberately, with no room for misunderstanding. "If you come here," I said, "you pay my rent. You follow my rules. No TV blaring at all hours, no smoking in the room, no leaving dishes in the sink, no complaints about the noise or the neighbors or the size of the bed. You live by my schedule, you clean up after yourselves, and you don't bring a single damn ounce of your entitlement through that door." My voice didn't raise, not even once. I didn't have to scream to be heard anymore. They sat in stunned silence, probably picturing the cramped space, the single bed, the creaky floor, the smell of cigarette smoke that seeped in through the thin walls. For years, I'd lived in their world, followed their rules, bent myself into silence so they wouldn't be uncomfortable. Now, for once, the roles were reversed, and it shook them to their core. My mother started to cry again, but not the manipulative whimpering she'd used to get her way. This time it sounded real, raw, desperate. My father tried to save face, tried to tell me it wasn't a practical solution, that they needed real help, not just shelter. I let him speak, let him fumble for dignity, and then I delivered the final blow with the same ice they'd once used to cast me out. "You always said you're not running a charity," I said, not even bothering to soften the edges of the words. "Well, neither am I." And just like that, the phone went silent. There was no shouting, no slamming of phones, no dramatic accusations. Just silence. A stunned, hollow kind of silence that stretched for several seconds before I heard my father's voice, low, cracked, and uncharacteristically defeated, say, "We'll think about it." I didn't respond. I didn't urge them to consider it. I didn't say I hoped they'd come. I just said, "Let me know by the end of the day," and hung up. Because I knew the truth, they wouldn't take the offer. Not because they couldn't stomach the living conditions, but because they couldn't stomach the power shift. They couldn't bear the thought of being beholden to the same daughter they discarded like some broken appliance when I stopped being useful. Still, I waited. Not for them, but for what it felt like to finally draw a line so clear, so impossible to cross without swallowing every ounce of their pride, that they'd rather drown than admit they needed me on my terms. And for the first time, I wasn't hoping they'd cross it. I wasn't hoping for reconciliation or redemption. I was just hoping they'd sit in their discomfort long enough to taste what it felt like to be powerless. They didn't call back that night. They didn't call the next. When they did, it was only to say they were trying to figure something out, that they appreciated the offer, but were looking into other options. I didn't push. I didn't press. I simply said, "Do what you have to do," and went back to my day. They left in silence. And I thought that was the end. But it wasn't. The days that followed were quieter than I ever imagined my life could be, the kind of quiet that doesn't echo with loneliness, but hums with peace, like a slow exhale after holding your breath for far too long. Mornings came gently, wrapped in soft light leaking through the thin motel curtains, and I started each one with a cup of tea by the window, watching the world drift by at its own lazy pace. The chaos I had once mistaken for routine was gone now. No more panicked calls, no more scrambling to meet their endless needs, no more weight of being the daughter who fixed everything while breaking quietly behind closed doors. I took walks without rushing. I slept through the night without waking to anxiety clawing at my chest, and I worked without resentment. My little freelance gigs had turned into something steadier, not glamorous but stable, and every time a payment landed in my account, it felt like another piece of my independence being stitched back into place. I'd made a habit of celebrating those small victories, a better rate from a new client, a compliment from an editor, a grocery trip that didn't involve choosing between bread and milk. No one clapped, no one noticed, but I did. And that was enough. Linda, my neighbor, continued to offer her wisdom in short, sharp sentences between cigarette breaks and folding laundry. She'd become a fixture in my life, not in the invasive way my parents had been, but in the way true companionship works, quiet, consistent, and without demands. She never asked about them, and I never brought them up. Some stories don't need retelling when the scars already speak for themselves. And then, one afternoon, just as I was preparing to step out for a walk, I saw the envelope. It had been slipped under my door, plain and unassuming, but I knew the handwriting the second I saw it. My father's, angular, precise, stiff like the man himself. I stood there for a full minute, just staring at it, my heart pounding not with fear, but something heavier, that strange mix of curiosity and dread that comes when the past refuses to stay buried. I picked it up, sat on the edge of the bed, and opened it with the same caution you use to disarm a landmine. Inside, there was a check. And a note. The check was made out to me, an amount that mirrored almost exactly what I'd spent on them over the years. Rent, utilities, repairs, groceries, every dollar I'd given, every sacrifice I'd made. It wasn't perfect, not exact to the cent, but it was enough that I knew they had kept track. Enough that I knew this wasn't just guilt, it was acknowledgement. The note was brief, written in my father's rigid hand, and it read simply, "For everything. We were wrong." There was no apology, no explanation, no invitation to talk or reconnect. Just those 5 words. For everything. We were wrong. I didn't cry. I didn't smile. I just sat there holding that check, thinking about all the years I'd waited for even a fraction of those words. And now that I had them, I realized I didn't need them. Not anymore. I didn't cash it. I didn't tear it up either. I went to the little thrift store down the road, bought a cheap wooden frame, and placed the check inside. I hung it right above the door of my motel room, not as a symbol of forgiveness or even closure, but as a reminder, not of what I lost, but of what I finally reclaimed. A month later, I moved out of that motel. I didn't buy a mansion or some flashy condo downtown. I found a quiet little apartment on the edge of town, with big windows that let in the morning sun, and just enough space for a desk, a bookshelf, and a kitchen that didn't reek of mildew. It wasn't perfect. The ceiling had a stain in the corner, and the faucet dripped when you didn't turn it just right. But it was mine. Mine in a way nothing ever had been before. The first thing I did when I moved in was hang that framed check above the door again. Not out of bitterness. Not out of pride. But as a marker of a chapter closed, of a story rewritten, of a woman who finally stopped shrinking herself to fit into someone else's broken expectations. And as I stood there that first morning, tea in hand, sunlight warming my bare feet on the cold tile floor, I whispered something into the stillness of my new beginning. I never got the love I wanted, but I found something better, my damn self. Sometimes revenge isn't fire and fury. Sometimes it's silence and self-worth. Sometimes it's choosing peace over pain, dignity over desperation, solitude over servitude. And sometimes, the most powerful thing you can do is walk away without burning the bridge, just leave it standing empty, so they can see exactly what they lost every time they look across and find no one waiting on the other side. But if they ever knock again, would I open the door? Honestly, I don't know. But I sure as hell wouldn't be the one to answer first.